Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. And this morning we have Professor Bruce Pardy, all the way from Florida today. And yeah, he's chuckling in there in the background. You're not on yet, Bruce. Stay quiet. This morning we got a couple of topics we want to talk about, and they do get into, as Bruce just pointed out, some areas of gray. They're not really, definitive one way or the other, but we need to have the conversation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in Richmond with the Indigenous claims and the court ruling that happened there. We're going to talk a little bit about that MOU that sent so many boos through the room at the AGM. And, this rumor of castle law. So self-defense and castle law are not the same thing. We're going to dive into that a little bit. And of course, the gun grab by the Liberal government. So with that in mind, welcome our guest, Professor Bruce Pardy.
Hello, Nadine. Great to be with you. Always.
Yes, Bruce. I'm just a little bitter that you're down in Florida enjoying the sunshine and it's like cold and snowy up here, but just a little bit.
I get that all the time. At least in the moments when I'm away. But everybody does. When you escape the Canadian winter, even briefly, that's usually the reaction.
I'm trying to keep Bruce laughing this morning. So all my videos are so serious, and it's like people think I'm such a serious person. I do have a sense of humor. Anyway, we're gonna dive in. Bruce doesn't, obviously. He's just okay. Let's get going. Get to the law, the facts. Gotcha this morning, didn't I?
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. Yeah. Well, it's not. Nadine is not the first time.
I may end up cutting all this stuff out.
Maybe you might. Yes.
Awesome. Well, Bruce, you've been following along what's been going on in Richmond, BC. And you've had a couple of interviews and discussions about that. And I think, for a lot of people here in Alberta, they're following along, they look at it, but there's a disbelief and there's this idea that can't happen here. We have treaties. So I was wondering if this morning maybe you would walk us through the decisions that were made and the court ruling and what implications, because we are seeing now, whether it be in Ontario, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, you're seeing them pop up all over. I want to talk about, why they think there's a claim there. And then, of course, people seem to think that Alberta is a safe zone because we do have treaties, and why that indeed may not be the case.
Right. Okay. Good question. For those who haven't heard, a decision out of British Columbia, the Cowichan decision, saying that Aboriginal title is held over a certain area in Richmond, BC. And that's an area over which government and other private parties, other parties hold fee simple property interests. And the most important line in the decision is the one that says that Aboriginal title is a senior and prior right to fee simple, meaning that if you own fee simple property in your house or in a factory, in land over which Aboriginal title is found to exist, then there is a senior and prior right to your interest. That fee simple interest, which you have believed to be the highest form of property possible in our property system, your ownership of that land is no longer secure. Now, this is a real problem in BC because much of BC is what they call unceded territory, that is not subject to treaties. That is not the situation in Alberta. Alberta is ceded territory pursuant to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. No, that's not true. 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. Correct. Mainly 6, 7, and 8. And so one would think that the kind of claim that was made in Richmond would not be possible in Alberta. And to some extent, that is true. The kinds of claims that are more likely to be made and have been made in Alberta are treaty entitlement claims. That is, there is a treaty, but what we received under the treaty is not what the treaty promised, or even more expansively, that what the treaty purports to say on paper and in English is not what the Aboriginal group in question thought that it was they were agreeing to. But the claims in Alberta, either way, would push off, probably in most cases, the existence of the treaty to argue about what the treaty says and what it means and whether it's valid and so on. So you're not going to get exactly the same kind of claim probably in Alberta as in British Columbia, but nor do the existence of the treaties mean that no Aboriginal land claims are possible. That's not true, and Alberta claims have been made and have been resolved and are still ongoing. One of the complications is you'd think that in the case of a treaty, which is essentially a contract or looks like a contract, that it would be fairly cut and dried, right? Here's the treaty, here's what it says, and here are the terms. It applies to this land, and here are the benefits. And you just read the provisions, and you're done. But as with legal documents generally, these things are open to interpretation. But moreover, there is now a inclination on the part of courts to accept a different kind of evidence, that is oral evidence about the written piece of paper.
Well, can we just stop there for a moment? Because I think it's important here to acknowledge this is where things like land acknowledgements come in, because somehow treaties and legal documents, including our Constitution, is now being open for interpretation. I think this is a Pandora's box. There is no more cut and dry. And when we have events like land acknowledgements, every time something is celebrated, opened, what are we doing when we acknowledge that?
Right. So the utterance of the land acknowledgement itself doesn't have any legal effect. So if you stand up before an event and you do a land acknowledgement, I mean, it's not because you uttered those words at that particular moment in time that something's going to happen. However, what is also happening is that there's a new, it's establishing a narrative, or even a principle in the public realm, and that principle, as it gets normalized and accepted, is starting to be realized in the decisions of the courts, and especially in that Cochan decision. That doesn't mean that tomorrow, all of Alberta is going to be handed over just because you stated a land acknowledgement. On the other hand, these land acknowledgements are acutely hypocritical in the sense that they state that you are undertaking your activity, or whatever it happens to be, on Indigenous land. And if you think that the land was ceded by treaty, well, then that's not true. So for a lot of people, they have to make up their minds. Are you on Indigenous land or not? And if you are, then maybe you should give it back. And if you're not, then maybe you should stop acknowledging that you are. Make up your mind.
Yeah, that's a big problem that I see, is that there's just, we've opened up this Pandora's box and there's no putting it back in neatly at this point. People have to make a decision one way or the other as to whether or not, you have a right to your property. And this is where, coming back to one rule of law, I think needs to come back into play into Canada, where, we keep carving things out for special interest groups. And Indigenous, I understand, there's this belief that they were here first, but they came from somewhere else as well, right? I mean, and we have this whole concept of conquer, and the British, as to many of your examples in the past, Scotland, Ireland, it goes on and on and on. I mean, Spain conquered, the Vikings conquered, everybody, we've all been conquered. None of us are really, and native, in my opinion, is just, you were born here, right? I mean, you are native to the land in which you were born. So, I think we've got to get away from this heritage of, your race, and your lineage, that goes back, somehow gives you more rights in Canada than others, because people look at me all the time and they go, Nadine, but they have a right to this. And I'm like, this is very dangerous territory. So let's just dive into a little bit more on the legal side of that, because, a decision has to be made at some point here. Either we all abide and fall under one rule of law, or we don't.
Yes. Well, absolutely true. And I've been saying this for a while. So all of that sort of legal analysis about land claims and so on, whether it's from a treaty or from about so-called unceded land and so on, has as a premise that there are different populations of people involved. And that is in direct contradiction to the idea that in a country, the law of the country ought to apply the same way to everyone without regard to your identity. Now, at the time that these treaties were made, you could make the case that there were, in fact, different peoples involved. You have a clash of civilizations, if you like, a clash of cultures. And there was conflict. You had the Europeans arriving on a continent where there were already people here. And the Europeans conquered the place. And we can say that because we know that they weren't invited and they would not have left. They weren't ready to leave. So they were there. They were there essentially by force. And what emerged from that historical event is the creation of new countries, including Canada. And this country is subject to the jurisdiction of the government of the country, the Crown. Canadian law applies to the whole territory. That's how you know it was conquered. Now, there are parts of that law, though, that insist upon treating people of different identities differently. And that's a violation of a principle that you find in its own law, which is blind justice. Everybody alive today was not alive at the time. And so our insistence that they continue to be treated as distinct peoples is the error. It is the error that is at the basis of all of the questions that we're talking about, including and especially the Cowichan decision. That decision is not possible if the courts and the law say, no, the law applies to everybody equally, and we are not concerned with who your parents are, what your lineage is, what your culture is or was, what identity you think you belong to. We don't do that, or we're not supposed to do that in other legal contexts. I mean, the result of a case should not depend upon whether you are rich or poor, or black or white, or male or female, or straight or gay. But we insist upon it. Actually, in Canada, we have fallen away from that idea, even outside of the Aboriginal realm. We can talk about that too if you want to, but it's most acute in Canadian Aboriginal law. We insist upon continuing this fiction that there are two distinct groups of people. We are now hundreds of years later. The culture is now a different culture than either the one that was here when the Europeans arrived or the ones the Europeans brought with them. It's a different third thing, and we are all part of that thing, and we are all part of the same people. I mean, people mix, they marry, they procreate, and even if they don't mix directly in that sense, they come together as a people. We apply the same law to people who were born here and immigrants. We don't distinguish between them on that basis. And so the idea that we should distinguish between the descendants of a certain group of people and the descendants of another group of people, in my books, is ridiculous. And to just go over that example that you referred to that I've used before, if you look at the UK, and of course, you can pick any example around the world. This has happened over and over again. This is the history of human civilization. Invasion, migration, and mixing is what happens in human civilization. But I've used the UK as an example. You know, the Romans invaded first, and then the Saxons came along, and then the Normans came along and deposed the Saxons. And, you know, in the UK, imagine the state of affairs if the law said, well, we're going to apply different rules to you depending upon whether you can trace Roman heritage or Saxon heritage or Norman heritage, or, you know, if you're a combination of those things. You know, it's crazy. It doesn't work. It makes no sense at all. The British people are British and they're subject to British law. That's the way it ought to work here. Canadian law applies to Canadian citizens, and everybody we're talking about is a Canadian citizen. So it's time to put this old idea away.
Well, it is funny because it's not just this. A large part of this problem came when BC decided to adopt the United Nations UNDRIP and then put into legislation themselves, which they didn't have to do, DRIPA. So, you know, this is, you know, again, a problem of our own making here.
This is all our own making. This is all our own making. Instead of evolving out of this old idea, we instead have doubled down and made it more acute, right? So just a slice of the history here. Pierre Trudeau's original draft of what became the charter included property rights, but did not include Aboriginal rights. What we got in 1982 was the reverse. There were no property rights. They were taken out at the behest of some of the premiers. And Aboriginal rights were put in Section 35, sort of as a result of a more or less last-minute campaign. So Aboriginal rights were guaranteed as they existed in 1982. But as a result of that section, the courts, and especially the Supreme Court of Canada, have since that time expanded the meaning and effect of those Aboriginal rights. So that's, for example, they discovered the duty to consult. UNDRIP comes along. UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a UN Assembly resolution, which on its own is not binding in international law and certainly cannot be enforced in any Canadian court. And Canada at first voted no. They did not adopt it, but the Trudeau government in 2015 announced that it would reverse that position. But on its own, you know, not enforceable. And then the British Columbia legislature in 2019 passed DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And that statute, the BC statute, essentially incorporates UNDRIP into BC law. It requires the BC government to make sure that BC law is consistent with the declaration. Okay. Now, what does the declaration say? It's pages and pages of rights and entitlements. But one of the things that it says is that Aboriginal peoples have the right to all the land that they ever occupied or used or otherwise were associated with, essentially. And especially in British Columbia, if you take that literally, that means what is now coming to be, which is there is a senior and prior right to all the land that is unceded, which is most of BC, to all the fee simple interests that might exist. Now, 95% of British Columbia is Crown land. And so the private fee simple conflict, you know, won't occur on that land. But nevertheless, what is now happening, the BC government is taking it upon itself. This is not the courts now. The BC government on its own is taking it upon itself to make agreements with Aboriginal peoples that give those groups management rights over the land. That is a veto over what the land is used for.
Well, we're seeing parks now where people cannot, you know, unless you're Aboriginal, you're not allowed access. And there's places where you're denied access because, again, only Aboriginals. So I want to, and I don't mean to cut you off there because I want to
okay, it's a long story. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a painful one to have to listen to because we're carving out all these special rights and we're ignoring the fact that we have people that have been born and raised here who have just as much right and entitlement to those areas as anybody else. But this has gone on, in my opinion, long enough. But to what purpose? I mean, this is, and I know people think this is a bit of conspiracy, but to what purpose would the BC government do this? Like, why would you hand over the rights and the title and the use of your crown lands to the Indigenous? Why would you do that?
Well, first, the first political calculation is that this speaks to the NDP's base. It's a policy that the base will like. It will increase their political calculation will be that this will increase their chances of maintaining power. But there's a probably a deeper explanation, because on the surface, this seems to be self-defeating, almost culturally suicidal, right? It's nihilistic, and it might be as simple as that. But so I'm reminded of a of a of a an interview that I saw on a clip long ago. There were there were it was an encampment protesting Wall Street. I forget the name of the movement now, but this was maybe a decade ago, and it was a socialist communist kind of ideology that they were advocating. They were protesting the existence of property rights and so on. And one reporter went into the group and asked them what they meant about property. And you heard the usual thing about evil capitalists and oppression and so on. And the reporter was there to make a point, and the reporter said to the person he was talking to, who happened to have an iPad in their hand. The reporter, took the iPad and said, "Well, can I have your iPad?" And the person said, "Well, no, that's my iPad." And the reporter said, "But you don't believe in property." And the person said, "Yeah, but I'm not talking about my property."
Mm.
And it was clear that they hadn't thought it through. The ideology meant that they were against certain things, but the implications of being against that hadn't struck them, because, well, in the sense that it was not going to affect them. It will be interesting to see in British Columbia if this spreads, when it starts to affect all the people who vote for the NDP and are in favor of all these policies, when their fee simple title is actually under threat as well. I don't know what will happen there, but there is an element of not only blindness about it, but also a nihilistic kind of cultural suicide. There's a desire to tear down the society in which these people live themselves.
Well, this aligns very much with Canada and Trudeau's post-nation state, and we don't have an identity. And I just look at the Indigenous population is so small, so small. You know what, 300,000 people, I guess, here in Alberta. I'm not sure, across maybe a million or so across the country. And yet we are just seem to just bow down and hand everything over. And I'm not, like, everybody has rights. I'm not here to, discriminate one way or the other. What I'm just here simply to point out is that if in Canada we don't have one rule of law that applies to everybody, we are just going to continue to have to carve out more and more rights for more and more individuals. And now we have a governing system and a court system that has to uphold this living doctrine. And as things change, as you pointed out, the agreement that was signed to and agreed to, 150 years ago, now you have the UN that's putting a completely different spin on that. And you got provinces that are jumping on board. And that's destroying the very fabric of, I think, credibility, legitimacy, and where does that leave Canada on a global scale from a standpoint of who would ever want to come here to do business here? Well, you don't own anything. Or, when I listen to all these global kind of agendas that Carney has, and then I look at, his wordsmithing. We want generational investments. We want more people to come here. Well, who in their right mind would come to BC right now to build something, to do something with all of this up in the air? It just seems to be very nihilistic, very self-defeating.
Yes. So let me suggest another angle to this as well. Let's reframe it a little bit. One of the problems with Aboriginal rights is that they are group rights. That is, they are not predominantly rights that individual Indigenous people hold. I mean, some of them are, tax exemptions and so on. But Aboriginal title, for example, is a group right. And because it is a group right, it is exercised and controlled by the leaders of the group, the elite of the group, not by the people themselves. And so the idea of expanding Aboriginal rights is consistent with the idea that elites should have more control over things. And it may be that there's a logic, and maybe it's not conscious even or expressed, but there's a certain logic in, look, if more rights and more control is exercised by an elite, we can work with the elite. Like, so if you're trying to build a pipeline and you believe in the legitimacy of government management of things, then it's not inconsistent with that belief that an Aboriginal elite is the party that you should be working with in order to ensure that things are controlled and constructed and managed in a way that's consistent with your vision. Note that the way that the current iteration of nation building projects that the Carney government's pursuing is a very government management heavy process. They are creating their own list of projects that they want to champion. Instead of saying, free market, you go ahead and build whatever projects you think are viable. That's not what's happening. This is a government-driven mandate. And it's not inconsistent with that to endorse the idea that Aboriginal groups, as represented by their elites, should be the ones helping the government to manage and control what actually gets built and when, under what conditions. It is a statist way of seeing the world, and the expansion of Aboriginal rights in the ways that we're describing is not inconsistent with that vision.
Yeah, and I think that's the point for me that I would like for people to understand, that this is an expansion of control. And I think by giving so much weight to this Indigenous idea, I think it's easier for the government to control a small group than it is to control a much larger, unwieldy population. And that's kind of where I'm tending to lean towards.
Sure. And so one of the interesting things about treaties, if you read, treaties 6, 7, 8, for example, I mean, it's very interesting because those treaties provide for, a payment to the members of the group an annual payment, but it's not an equal payment. It's not an equal payment for every person. It's a payment for, rank and file, and then it's a different, higher payment for the chief.
Well, the part for me too is look at how much the government budget is included for Aboriginal in the administration, apparently, of Aboriginal rights and special privilege. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that's baked into the budget each and every year. And that money's not going down to the average everyday person living on a reserve. That money is bureaucracy, it's administration, it's, rank and file, like you said. Then a little bit more goes to the Aboriginal elites, the hierarchical chiefs, and then very little is actually seen at the very bottom, to the point where they don't even have clean drinking water in many cases.
Well, this is what Francis Widdowson and others have called the Aboriginal industry, right? It serves a certain group of interests, including Aboriginal elites, but also bureaucrats and lawyers and policy people, and there's a whole lot of very expensive activity going on, very expensive activity, and the money is ending up exactly as you say, not in the pockets of individual Indigenous people, and as we all know, the conditions on some of the reserves is not very good. But yet there's a massive amount of money that's being spent. And so where is it going? Now, of course, the Harper government, before it finished, put in place a regime to make the spending of this money transparent, to require banned reporting for how where the money goes.
Trudeau removed it.
And one of the first things that the Trudeau government did was take away those requirements.
Yeah. And again, why would a government take away the requirement to account? Then again, you see this going on in Ukraine right now. We have how many billions of dollars that have gone missing, hundreds of billions of dollars that have gone missing in Ukraine. And what does Canada do? Send over another 200 million? Like,
Sure.
They feed the corruption.
Well, you could even go further. You can go further and say, look, the country has become a grift. Its best industry is trying to skim off money from the public purse, because
They're very
so
good
many of our
at
other
it.
so many of our other industries are running into trouble that really all you've got is government largesse.
Well, I mean, Stellantis, the government just gave them what, 15 billion, and they just walked that over to the United States and gave them 13 billion. So, I have this real problem with government getting involved in business, whether it be a subsidy or whether it be directly through a grant or whatever, because the problem is they are picking the winners and the losers. And as you say, they are forcing an agenda without the market, standing behind it. It's doomed to fail. So we saw this with the EV. We saw this with eating crickets. These are great ideas that the government had. But, unless the market, the people themselves are going to, buy in, which if they were, the governments would already be doing that. Or the government wouldn't need to be doing subsidies, but private business would already be doing that. So,
Correct. Right. But you are putting your finger on one of the basic problems in this country, which is that most of the people seem to believe in the system that they have, which is causing all this trouble. It legitimizes grift because it legitimizes subsidy. It legitimizes protection. It legitimizes regulation. It legitimizes the government's role in planning the economy, like Carney's list of nation-building projects. I mean, in a different kind of country with a different set of ideas, the proposition that the government would come forward with a list of commercial developments that it wants to see would be met with outrage, because that's not supposed to be the role of the government. But not in Canada, because this is the way we've done things. We've done it this way for a long time. It may be more acute now than ever, but for a long time it has been a centrally driven culture, and it is very difficult to get people to change their mind about what it is that they're used to. So you reap what you sow.
well, I think for so many people, they like simplicity. They like to be able to point the finger at the greedy capitalist or point the finger at the greedy investor. They don't want to take a look at government because government's too complicated. But yet that's where the finger should be pointed. Even with, I love the Algora steel, the union came out and said this has nothing to do with tariffs. This has everything to do with government policy. And they threw it right back where it belonged. And, so many people just refuse to see this. I mean, even this morning, you saw my husband Jason there a moment ago. And he came up the stairs. He says, "Oh, I watched a podcast this morning. There's somebody on there talking about in BC about the greedy investors have driven up the cost of housing." And it's like they're creating the shortage of supply. There's no shortage of supply because of the greedy investor. There's a shortage of supply because you can't build affordably. Why? Because you can't keep up with the cost because regulation has driven everything up. What you could build at one time, which with double paned windows and 10,000 nails, now requires triple paned windows and 4 times the amount of nails. And the cost of a one piece of 2x4, which used to be 50 cents, is now $5.50. That's what's driving. And then people go, well, that's the greedy business owner driving up those costs. It's like, no, that's regulation. That's driving up those costs. That's government policy.
It's regulation, but it's also monetary policy, right? It's
Right.
also the expansion of the money supply. It's COVID lockdowns. It's the consequence of having a central bank. It's a consequence of the government trying to manage things. It's a consequence of artificially low interest rates. It is a government produced problem that people expect the government to fix, right? It's a loop.
Can you please repeat that a little louder, Bruce, for people to hear it? A government produced problem that people expect the government to fix. Do you think
Correct.
they have any desire or interest to fix the problem that they themselves have created? This is a problem. Business makes a mistake, they pay for it directly in profits. They're quick to correct course and move forward, or they go out of business. Government makes a mistake, they double down, they spend more money, they develop more policies, they create more regulation, and then the problem just compounds, and then the taxpayer pays more, and then they're looking at everybody else but the government as the problem.
Right. So I've asked this question in the past. Can anyone think of something that modern governments do well?
Regulation.
Well, they do it well in their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're very good at pursuing their own interests and expanding their own control of things. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is, if the purported purpose of government activity is to improve the lives of their citizens, can anybody think of anything that modern governments do well in this country? And I challenge them to identify anything. And that they're going to say, well, but it's important that governments provide public education or regulation about this and so on. That's not what I'm saying. I'm asking, can you think of any of those things that you think they should be doing that they are doing well? I bet you the answer is no.
No, I know how I would answer that question. I would just like to see the government get out of the way. But until people wake up to the reality that the government is the problem. And I love, I was in California and I went to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And I had a lot of fun there because, listening to his old speeches and things, trust but verify, all these little, nuances that he had. But I mean, he was a hardcore, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. It's like, you run. The government is the problem. And we've come such a long ways from those days of recognizing that we need small government to do a very small number of things that are convenient for us because, things like national defense are hard to coordinate. But, when the government now is in our lives daily, we are the ones asking for permission. I made the comment one time that my grandfather in Newfoundland, he built his own home. It's still standing. People, oh, you can't do that. You can't allow people to do that because, it would burn down. Well, I don't know. There's lots of new homes that catch on fire that burn down, but my grandfather's home is still standing. When you got 9 kids, to make sure that you've got a home and a shelter to put over their heads, you're going to make sure that probably it's, built to last, right? But we're not allowed to build our own homes anymore. We're not allowed in many places to grow our own food anymore. These are becoming big, big problems. The government wants to control what you eat, when you eat, where you live, how you live. And people keep demanding the government do more of this centralized planning and control.
And this, for me, is one of the questions that has yet to be answered for Alberta. Because a lot of Albertans, I get the sense, sort of think the same way. I mean, they don't want to be trapped by Ottawa. Yeah, that's fair enough. But they don't realize that they have an equally intrusive government in Alberta. There's an Albertan managerial state as well.
Yeah.
And if you are determined to have that Alberta government in an independent country carry on doing what governments do in this country, in Canada, then you're not thinking very big. You're trying to reproduce what it is that you already have just without Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hardly worth it. Why bother? You're not changing the nature of your society. You're not providing yourself with more room to move, free from the clutches of the bureaucrats. That's not the case. If you're Albertan and you're determined to have an independent Alberta with an Alberta government that does all the things that governments do now in Alberta, provincially and federally, well, I don't understand. What's the point?
Yeah, there wouldn't be one because, in essence, we just fall into the exact same disarray, and probably at a faster rate. The whole purpose of this exercise is to build a freer, more prosperous. There was, I think, a survey that came out not too long ago that, Alberta, Canada, general, like we don't even register on free and prosperous lists anymore. Every other,
Right.
state,
Right.
ranks pretty much above us.
That's right. That is correct. And Alberta is the most prosperous of the Canadian provinces, but
Yeah.
it is not at the top of the list when you
It
put
didn't even
provinces
make
and
the
states.
list.
And this is one of our Canadian problems, right? Because if you explore, what a lot of Canadians think that their identity is, of course, it's not American. And one of the things that distinguishes the not American country is the degree to which the government is involved in things. People love to be pleased about Canadian healthcare. Canadian healthcare, a government-controlled, single-payer public healthcare system, one of the worst in the developed world, is a source of pride to a lot of Canadians. That in itself is an indication of why we have such a lot of problems in this country.
Well, even here in Alberta, AHS, where we've got people dying literally to waiting on wait lists to get treatments. And Smith is trying her best to, at least introduce legislation that would allow doctors to work outside of their public responsibilities. So adding service, not taking anything away, just adding more service. You have people fighting this. This is how ridiculous this is. I always say envy is a very green, nasty little monster. It is a deadly sin for a reason. Jealousy is one of those, I want what you have. My gosh, that jacket is amazing. Where do I get it? But it's not destructive. Envy is if I can't have it, then you can't have it either. There is so much missed opportunity on the healthcare system, even here in Alberta. People leave. People don't get this. Money can move. So those who have it, they just move. They leave, they deploy their money elsewhere. So money that could have stayed in your own province, that could have hired new nurses, that could have employed new services, that could have created new innovation. All you do is you push it out by saying it's not welcome here. And this is the whole problem I'm having right now today with so many conversations, is people are looking at all these old systems and they're trying to preserve them when they are indeed the problem. And when even and me, I'm not a fan of Danielle Smith's policies, not the person but the policies. But even when she does make an effort to go in the right direction, she's met with so much resistance from these special interest groups, and I would say the unions in this particular case, that are just fighting to preserve their power, their self-interest. And in this particular case, they're like, well, they don't want to have to compete against the private sector. Why? Because they might actually have to do something.
Sure. Yes. But it's not the unions that's holding the thing back. It's the public sentiment. It's because that union sentiment has an audience, and people swallow the argument that we're all better off with a government-controlled system. Not true, but it's very difficult to move politically if large chunks of your population think that they are better off this way. They've never known anything different. And so what it really is a fear of the unknown.
That's a big point, because they've never known anything different. And this is the problem I have with these little incremental steps that governments take, because that little incremental step over a decade, now you have an entire generation that doesn't know how things used to be. And that becomes a problem, because now 2 decades, 3 decades, now here we are 5 decades, 6 decades away from like the 1960s, I think, when you saw major shifts towards this socialist, totalitarian kind of mentality, peace, love, no war, which, and now today you're seeing all of that come home to roost. So, people ask me why I get so upset when I object to a little thing. It's like, well, because if you don't object to the little thing, they will add 10 more little things, and then it becomes a very big thing. And in a generation, you can't change it.
But you see, this is also why you can't fix things incrementally, right? Because government only, grows in one direction. It never shrinks. It always grows. So the more incremental steps there are, the more it will grow, right? So the proposition that we're going to fix this incrementally, we take a step back. We'll fix the healthcare in this respect. That doesn't work, because you are not acknowledging the nature of the beast you're dealing with. The beast is expansive. And sure, you can fiddle in the margins and curb this one small thing, or slash a budget here, or fix the waste over here. That does nothing in the long term. If you're really going to fix this kind of a problem, in my books, you have to do it cold turkey. Like, no, we are changing the idea. The old idea is a bad idea. We're throwing it out. Government should not be involved in these things, period. And we are changing to a new paradigm. And that means we're starting fresh. And this is one of the reasons why Alberta independence is attractive to me, because you have a chance to start fresh. But that depends upon whether the people are up for it, to start fresh, as opposed to saying, no, we have a thing, let's just adjust it a little bit so that it suits us better. Right? That won't fix very much, because you're trying to do it incrementally. Government control cannot be fixed incrementally. You have to start with a different idea.
So we need a new vision of what Alberta would look like, and we need to throw out the old and replace it with something new. Now that scares a lot of people, because a lot of people say, oh, well, you're trying to burn down the system. And it's like, well, we're not trying to burn down the system. You're trying to replace what's broken. So you don't replace part of the mirror that's broken, right? You replace the entire mirror.
Yes. Right. Yes. Correct.
Right.
Correct.
I mean, you can't, there's no parts here that, you can't do this piece by piece.
Right. And so and there's a very understandable inclination when you're trying to imagine, a different system. The danger is you'll end up doing what Carney is doing with this list of nation building projects, right? You come in and you say, like an engineer, and say, all right, how should we design this so that the society works in this certain way, and so that we get the results that we want? How can we manage it and manipulate it and put it together so that the structure is no. And
Cultural
that's not the
engineering.
idea. The idea is you establish a set of principles that allow people to make their own way, and then whatever happens, folks. That's what freedom is. It is a free economy with free people who are figuring it out on their own and in combination with each other through voluntary contractual transactions, what kind of a world you want to build. Don't try and build the world ahead of time, because then you're doing exactly the same thing you're trying to get away from. Leave it be. Establish the idea and then let the thing run.
Yeah. And that's where the prosperity comes from. When you have individuals that get creative, that get innovative, and then work for themselves to see, the betterment of society, their families. I had this conversation with a young man. I think I've told you this story before about, his fear he was a teacher. And when I told him an idea about, allow the money to follow the child, he's like, well, everybody'd want to come here. And I'm like, so you're afraid of the competition? They don't want to have to better themselves, or at least be constantly trying to better themselves. And I think that's the whole purpose of being human, is that you wake up this morning and you're a better version of the self you were yesterday. When you wake up tomorrow, you should be a better version of the self you are today. And this is this ongoing. And I think people naturally, human nature is to do the least amount possible. And that's not what we were designed ideally to do. We are designed constantly to be growing, to be expanding, to be, being better versions of ourselves. And that's what the free market allows. And that's what government prevents. I can't be the best version of myself because I'm having to ask permission of somebody else, and I'm being told what I can and cannot do. And that becomes a problem. So, okay, because I know we have a little bit of a restriction on time, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with respect to castle law in this conversation in Alberta. So many people heard Danielle say, if you don't want to get shot, don't break into somebody's home. And they're interpreting that as if she is going to introduce castle law into Alberta. That is not the case. So I want you to break down for us a little bit about the difference between self-defense, which we do have a right to do. It's not easy to defend yourself in court, but you do have a right to defend yourself, your liberty, your life. But that is not castle law. Why don't you break that down for us a little bit?
Okay, so this is a little bit complicated. I'll try and make it as simple as possible. So let me start with an old joke. A Brit and an American and a Frenchman and a Canadian are asked to write an essay about the elephant from their national perspectives. And the Brit writes an essay called "The Role of the Elephant in the Expansion of the British Empire." And the American's essay is called "Free Markets and the Elephant." And the Frenchman's essay is titled "The Love Life of the Elephant." And the Canadian writes an essay, and its title is "The Elephant, a Provincial or Federal Responsibility." The division of powers between our provinces and the federal government is a national obsession, and it has been, at least in the law, for a long time, because of the way the British North America Act has been enacted. It lists federal areas of responsibility and provincial areas of responsibility, and those divisions, in many cases, don't make a lot of sense. So we're stuck, and have been stuck from the very beginning with trying to figure out what the provinces can do and what the feds can do. And this is one of those areas, right? So in the BNA Act, now the Constitution Act 1867, the federal government has jurisdiction over criminal law. The criminal code is a federal statute and is under the purview of Parliament and Parliament alone. The provinces cannot amend the criminal code. So if Danielle Smith is trying to suggest, and I don't think she is, but it sounds like she is, that Alberta is going to amend the criminal code or the substance of the law so that different rules apply in Alberta than elsewhere, that is nonsense. There's no provincial jurisdiction to do that. The criminal law right now says that you can defend yourself, your property, your family with reasonable force. And it is the interpretation of the reasonableness of the force that is the problem. Right? On the other hand, the provinces under the BNA Act have jurisdiction over the administration of justice. Right? So it is provincial officers that have the primary job of enforcing, like police and prosecutors and so on, enforcing the criminal law. So you have one level of government passing the law and another level with the primary responsibility of enforcing it. And, the police forces across the country, for example, have policies that are provincial policies made at the provincial level, pursuant to provincial powers. And you can see how those have different contents and expression across the country. So the case that a lot of people think about in this current discussion about castle law, so labeled, is the case from Peterborough, where a guy broke into a house with a crossbow, and the owner grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him. And the owner, the homeowner, was the one who got charged. Or the other guy might have been charged as well, but the homeowner got charged for stabbing the guy who broke into his house with a crossbow. And people are understandably outraged, like, well, come on, the guy had a crossbow and was inside my house in the middle of the night. What do you expect? But the policy, and I don't know what the policy was in this case, but I wouldn't be surprised if the policy was, if there's an assault and injury, then you charge the person, and then the Crown prosecutor will work it out. That doesn't mean you're going to be convicted, but it means you're charged, and being charged is a big problem. It's an expensive problem, and it's the process is the punishment kind of thing. So if Danielle Smith is merely talking about policy, that is, what should the policy book for the police forces across Alberta with respect to these kind of situations? Well, okay, that could be something that is within the power of the province to do. Let's just acknowledge the tension here, though, which arises out of this very strange division of powers. Let's say that you're a province and you are determined to make sure that no homeowner ever gets charged with anything that happens as a result of somebody being on their property. Okay? Because that's sort of the absolute way that it's often spoken. And I believe that's sort of the flavor of what Danielle Smith said at the UCP AGM. In other words, you are entitled to defend your property and yourself and your family. I don't know what her exact words were, but no questions asked. Okay, well, that's not true. There are always questions asked. So let me give you a scenario. This thing might seem straightforward, and I agree that in the case of the guy with the crossbow, that should be straightforward, no question. But let's say you own a cabin in the woods, and somebody in the middle of the night, comes to your cabin in the middle of the woods, and you hear them, and you scare them away, and they're running away from your cabin, and you have a shotgun and you shoot them in the back. And it turns out that this person was lost in the winter, trying to find a way not to die from frostbite exposure, and found a cabin, and you didn't answer when they banged on the door, so they tried to break in to try and find shelter, and they discovered that you were there, and they ran away, and you shot them in the back. Okay, well, that's not the same thing at all. You're going to be charged.
Oh, I can I have lots of friends through drunken stupors have climbed in through the wrong house's window, completely mistaken. And it's like, so it's, I get it. I get it. I mean,
Right.
it's not a cut and dry
Yeah.
thing, but I guess.
So, just hold on, but just to the point. So here's the tension between the provincial administration of justice to make, the power to make policy, and the federal jurisdiction over criminal law. So let's say you're a province and you want to make sure that none of the people in your province are charged for a certain criminal offense. Okay, and you make a policy and you dictate to your police that you are never to charge anybody with this crime. Okay, now you're beyond your powers, because what you are essentially doing is amending the criminal code without amending it. I mean, the wording is still the same because only Parliament can change that. But your policy says you're going to ignore the words in the criminal code. That's not going to be a thing in the province. Okay, that's probably further than you are able to go.
So this applies to the guns too, because she's saying that she's not gonna, and again, she's not saying she's gonna, much to, like, I think a lot of people are interpreting. So I don't think it's her saying she's implementing castle law. I think a lot of people are interpreting what she's saying is, oh, yay, we're going to have castle law here, which is not going to be the case. I mean, that is a criminal code issue, not a provincial issue that we can't violate. But the guns one comes in a little bit more relevant because you have federal legislation now that says, you can't buy, sell, trade handguns, for example. So something happens to me tomorrow, I can't give my handguns to my husband. They go back to the government, right? So in essence, we've banned them. So within 2 decades, those are all gone. There'll be nothing left for handguns. So we've disarmed our population on that front. Now, the gun issue, though, what she has said is that she's going to direct prosecutors, and she's going to direct the police to not confiscate them. Now, here it becomes even more problematic because in Alberta, we have the RCMP. And even though we contract them, they are a federal police force, not a provincial police force.
That's true. Yep. But we see, but this is the tangle, right, between the provincial powers and the federal powers. How far can the federal government go to insist that the RCMP, enforce things that the provincial government, who has jurisdiction over the administration of justice, has said, you shouldn't do that. And much of Canada runs through cooperative federalism. I mean, both levels accept the other levels' areas of jurisdiction, and they basically do it together.
Since
we
when?
have a huge, forever. So we see that
Alberta
even
does not
today,
feel that way.
Yeah, but this is a bit of a myth. There are lots of things that even today Alberta and the federal government cooperate about.
Oh, yes.
Right? And so it would be very easy if either level was determined to trigger a constitutional crisis. It'd be very easy to do, just to say, look, no, we're not doing that. Just no way. Just forget it. You have your areas of jurisdiction, but we don't accept what you've done, and we will not be putting any of that in place. We'll do everything in our power to make sure that the law that you've created legitimately does not have effect in this province. It's a way to produce a constitutional conflict, right? And for the most part, these things don't happen. Often, on occasion, they end up in courts, right? So Alberta has challenged a number of federal statutes over time, like the No Pipelines Act and the carbon tax. They lost the carbon tax case. They partially sort of won the No Pipelines Act, but not really. But that's one of the functions that the courts have in this country. The courts that tend to be more heavily inclined towards federal powers than provincial ones, but again, not across the board in every case. But you have a very awkward constitutional arrangement between the provinces and the feds, and the kind of tension that we're talking about right now about guns and about defending your property is a product of the awkward division of powers that we have.
Yeah, separation is such an easy solution to all of that.
Yes, correct.
It is. I mean, if each province was its own little country, there is nothing that prevents us from continuing to work together when it suits us. But, we can embrace our own heritage, embrace our own ideas, and embrace those things and our values that matter most to us, and everybody else would be free to do so, because what we have right now is this top down and east west and every which way from Sunday different group trying to influence government to force everybody else to do what it is they want to do. So
Right, right.
so
Which
and
maybe,
I
which
thought
maybe brings us, which maybe brings us to the MOU, right? Because that's an instance of apparent provincial federal cooperation, and it's so Canadian to do it in this way. It's so pathetic, that the two governments are coming together to approve of a project that ought to be, and maybe will be done by the private sector. It's like just get out of the way and let the enterprises do their own thing. But no. This is the Canadian way. And the idea that this is a triumph, it should be lauded. It's look, Canada works. No. The very reason that you had to do this kind of agreement is a reflection that Canada does not work. This is an indication of the problem, not the solution.
Okay, say that again. This is the very product that indicates that Canada does not work. Did everybody hear that?
That's
Because
right.
this MOU, she at the AGM, I think thought she was going to get cheers. Her and her entire cabinet, when she mentioned that, their faces when the room booed was just
Yeah,
there was shock and awe there. I
right.
don't think she was expecting that at all. And I think that's because the audience that is in that room now, it's not the same audience as it was 10 years ago. Business
Right.
leaders and policymakers and people who wanted to influence government. We have grassroots in there now, and they're educated. They've gotten smart. They've become engaged. They know what's going on. They saw right through the MOU for what it was. And yet she
Right.
thought she was going to get this big win. You see all the headlines. Oh, she's checked off, Bruce. She's checked off 7 of those 9 demands. In your
Right.
opinion, how many of those demands have we checked off?
Oh man, I wouldn't want to give you a number because I haven't gone through the list like that. But
It's an MOU. Do you need to go through
it's
the list?
it's an MO. So the point you're alluding to, which is quite right, is that the answer should be 0 because it's just an MOU. It's not legally binding. It's just a statement of intent. It is a political document, and it's a political document. It looks like for both of the parties, the federal government and Alberta. And of course, the federal government has been making noises about essentially giving both Aboriginal groups along whatever route it's on and the BC government effectively a veto, not a legally enforceable veto, a political veto, as in the federal government won't go forward until it's satisfied that all these other groups are happy with it. Yeah. It's that's useless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like waving a piece of paper as though you've won something where the piece of paper doesn't really mean anything. It's purely symbolic. But
Congratulations, you got a participation award.
yeah, but even more fundamentally, so when Smith sent Carney this letter months ago with these 9 demands, I said at the time that the worst, I mean, first of all, I said that it's unlikely that those demands will be met.
Yeah.
But even more fundamentally, it would be a bad thing if they were met, because it would look like problems are being solved. But actually, that would not be the case at all. It would have the potential effect of undermining the drive to independence, but not actually fundamentally change anything. Okay? Because these are all policies of current governments. And Alberta's problem, as with the rest of the country, but Alberta's problem is a constitutional problem. It is an architectural problem. The problem is that you have to ask the federal government for permission to do all these things. And if today the federal government sort of gave in and said, well, okay, we're going to get rid of the emissions cap, and we're going to postpone net zero, and maybe we'll build you a pipeline, if the conditions are right. It's like, these are mere policies. And if you get a yes today, you'll get a no tomorrow. And if the federal government still has the power to say no, you've still got a problem.
And therein lies the problem. And, this fanfare, this great win-win, and, her comment that we'll just have to trust. I went, you got to be kidding me. You want me to trust the guy that wrote a book called Values that, is a green zealot? You want me to trust the guy that's been advising the other guy for the last 5 years that's done all this harm? And it just feels like she tried to pull a fast one over on Albertans, and I think it truly backfired on her.
Lucy in the football.
Mm.
Right? Charlie Brown, Lucy in the football. Like, no, this time we really mean it. Go on, kick the ball. No, seriously, we really, really mean it this time. I promise that I'll hold the ball and let you kick it this time.
Yeah, and the MOU is even worse because Alberta will follow through on its commitments, because I do believe there are, when Alberta says it's going to do there is integrity here. Like, people value integrity. It's very important. It's ingrained in the culture. And, she made commitments to increase the carbon industrial tax price. And the problem with that is, again, once you implement something, taking it away is very, very difficult to do. So why is it that we put the condition on Alberta to do something first, when Alberta is usually not the problem here? Alberta usually, when it commits to do something, does it. It's the federal government, but yet they have no commitment to do anything.
That's correct. That is a correct reading, in my opinion. Yes. And moreover, what you do not have in the MOU or anywhere else is a rejection of the idea of net zero.
Yes.
That's
she's
what you
totally
require.
on board with it. This whole carbon tax,
but as long as
pathways.
as long as she is, and as long as Alberta is on board with net zero, you have not solved anything, because the rationale for an increased, industrial carbon tax is climate change, is net zero. Yeah. It's like you're still playing the same game. And after all, that the plan for the pipeline is for decarbonized oil.
Yes.
I mean, that signals that the whole thing is a boondoggle, because you can't decarbonize oil. There's no reason to do that in market terms. That means that the whole thing is created for government subsidies to create technologies and build plants to do things that's not necessary. Like, it's just a continuation of the same kind of grifting that exists now.
Well, the Pathways Alliance are the 5 big producers, and the only reason they go along with this is because there is subsidies in there from the government to do so. If, again,
That's what I mean.
if decarbonization and carbon capture was profitable, they wouldn't need government subsidies to encourage them to do so. They'd be all over it. So, the fact, and the subsidies are like 50%. So people don't understand. But again, now you have an industrial cost going up on your carbon for pricing, and people don't see, oh, no, but that's not a consumer. Well, the consumer is still going to pay for it. If you put that on the producer, and here's the worst part, you put that at the top level of the producer. Now everybody down in the supply chain who now has an increased cost from here, they get an increased cost. Well, they've got to recover that cost. Now there's an additional cost. So what looks like a 37% increase, by the time it gets to the consumer, is much higher, because everybody else's cost has gone up in between. And
of course,
and as to your point, the grift, now you got subsidies. So the producer doesn't really care. Right? He's getting a subsidy to do it, or a tax credit to do it. It's not costing him anything. The only person this is going to hurt are a lower middle class people. right? The people
Sure.
out there working
Yep.
on these rigs.
Yep. It's as if the people running the country really do not understand how economies work.
Oh, I know they don't understand how economies work.
What are you supposed to do? It's like that's what they insist upon. It's what the method they've been using for a long time. Look at the state of the country and how well it's doing or not doing. It's like it's patently obvious, but yet it continues.
Well, I mean, Danielle Smith, right from day one, people are like, she's still on this net zero climate change. And I flagged that right from the very beginning with her in her speeches. It's like, Danielle, you have to abandon this idea that somehow we can influence and control the climate. And that doesn't mean for me, like, there's a difference between environment and climate. You make a mess, in my opinion, you clean it up, right? That is your
Sure.
responsibility. And do not be polluting our oil or our waterways. You know, again, you make a mess, you clean it up. But this whole
Sure.
idea of carbon, they're cutting down trees thinking that we're somehow reducing the carbon footprint. Like, and the headlines are never as they appear. You know, the devil's always in the details, but nobody reads the details anymore, Bruce.
Sure. And there are so many different ways to debunk the climate change net zero
Mm.
thing. I mean, it doesn't make sense on so many levels. One of them, just to give you one example, and you're familiar with all of these. One of them is the fact that Canada is today and has always been net zero. Right? There is no net. Even if climate change, anthropogenic climate change was a thing, and even if there was a problem, and even if fossil fuels were contributing to the problem, and those are three ifs I don't believe. But let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just say that, all right, we'll use those. Let's assume that they're true, for example. Even so, Canada is today and has always been net zero. None of the human activity in Canada produces a net output in this country because of the nature of the country, the population and the forests and the nature of the topography. It's a scam. It's a complete scam.
Well, like I said, there's people around the world that are waking up to the fact that it's a scam. The green revolution that happened in Europe just about collapsed their economy, and that they're still not out of the wake of that yet. Saskatchewan has tried the carbon capture. There's no demand. They can't make that work. And now we're going to just repeat again. To me, it hurts me to watch this because it always boils down to the fact that the taxpayer is paying. We got a federal government that's, borrowing money and sending it elsewhere, doing projects like this that are doomed to fail because they're just not sounded in good sound economic policy. And yet, again, they sit there in all, we're decreasing the cost of living. We're trying to bring business back to Canada. And I'm like, yet everything they do, Bruce, every action that they take is the exact opposite of the lovely, pretty words that they speak.
What is your theory about why net zero is a thing in Alberta?
Well, have you ever read the book Limits to Growth?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think it's pretty obvious what they're trying to do. MAID is the third leading cause, in my opinion, now of death here in Canada, and not even for people who are chronically ill and dying, but you're depressed. We're targeting youth now.
Well, that explains the ideology elsewhere, and I understand why the federal government is into all these things. But in Alberta,
Yes.
I would have thought that the culture was such that these ideas would have been rejected because, after all, they are direct threats to the prosperity
Well, I
of
think
the
the hard
province.
part in Alberta is Alberta's not Albertan anymore. More and more people have moved here from elsewhere, and they're bringing their politics with them. It's kind of like California, right? It's like it was once a very Republican state, now it's a very
Yeah.
Democrat state. And how did they do that? Migration. So,
Mhm.
I think that plays part of it. And then I think the education system is a big part of it as well. I think in the education system today, kids are being educated, indoctrinated, in my opinion,
Yeah.
instructed to
Right.
believe that there is this. I walked into a high school when I was doing a campaign in 2019, and we talked about climate change because I was the only one, the People's Party of Canada, to say that this is a hoax. We have to stop this nonsense before it takes a foothold, and
Yep.
spoke out against it. Well, when I presented my arguments, the kids couldn't present them. And then the teacher felt he came to their defense, and he says, "Well, it's in the jet stream." And that was supposedly the answer to everything. It's in the jet stream. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, wow. I
Right.
could at the time recite you studies and, climate change experts and geologists, who do the ice samples and, one after the other after the other. And I said to the kids, where's the crisis? I said, look out at this big, beautiful blue sky here. No smog in the air today. It's, big crisp blue sky Alberta day. And that's when the teacher piped up, well, it's in the jet stream. And I went, oh my good Lord.
Right.
So we're teaching our children, because again, licensing and registration require them to have teachers who come from a certain educational background that are being educated in the universities, who are coming in with these ideologies where they've been taught. So I think, a lot of it is coming back to, in Alberta, we got a migration problem from people from there bringing their ideology here. But I think even in our own curriculum, and again, to your point about, if we don't get the Canada out of Alberta, what's the point of doing this? Our curriculum is broken on the
Well, yes,
education system.
and that brings us full circle, right?
Yeah.
Because your curriculum problem is a government problem
Yep.
because the government runs the schools, so therefore the government controls the curriculum. And
Yep.
if you really want to fix the curriculum, then you get the government out of the business of providing education.
Yep.
It's all reinforcing. And from one thing to the next thing. You got to get out of the loop, and to get out of the loop, you have to remove the government's role in so many of these things.
Yes. Yes. I know you have to run away. Any last parting words?
No, I think we've done pretty well this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. I really, it's so funny. We have a lot of these offline. So today was more of that offline conversation online, which was nice. So many people can see what we kind of banter back and forth about. Um, Alberta independence question. Have you changed your mind on that? Still, this is the path forward.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, the, I don't see any other path forward in this country for Alberta or for the rest of the country either. I absolutely. It's still going to be difficult. It was always going to be difficult, but we do have good news, which is that the UCP has decided to amend the Citizens Initiative Act to take out that problematic Section 2.4, which never made sense. It's the reason why the proposed question was in the court. And thankfully they have heeded the call. They say they're going to repeal that section, and they have introduced a bill 14 in the
Mhm.
legislature to do exactly that. Now, that's great. That's good. It is missing something, which is that it does not repeal the section of the Referendum Act that restricts the effect of a referendum on Aboriginal rights. That has to go as well. That's section 8.11 bracket 3, I believe. That should be eliminated too. But nevertheless, it's a step in the right direction.
Well, they've kind of indicated that, they are going to relax it enough to allow the question to be asked, but they have not committed to anything that violates the Constitution. So,
Well, yes. And that's not really a change because a lot of this is under their control. Was before and will remain so, right?
yeah,
So they are not, even this process under the Citizen Initiative Act would not have dictated the end result, right? So there's still there's a process up until the point where the government basically takes over and decides what they want to do. So this is still, it's still murky. This is not for sure thing at all. It still very much depends upon what the government chooses to do. So let's not over do this and say, you know, it's done. It's a long way from done. And even in legal terms, this change, as beneficial as it will be, is not a panacea. Nevertheless, it's this particular step is in the correct direction, and that I think we should praise.
Well, I think absolutely. I think, you know, we want to build on that momentum. So keep the pressure, is what I keep telling people. Keep the pressure on, because without that pressure, politicians will do nothing. So there needs to be that public pressure to get them to take the actions and move them in the direction that we want them to go.
This is an opportunity to show them that they have no choice. If they want to be on the right side of the people, then that they have no choice but to pursue this, because that's what the people want. That's the challenge right now.
Yeah, and that was very evident at the AGM when Jeffrey Rath, you know, stood and asked the people in the room whether they were in support of Alberta independence, and 85-90% of the room went to its feet. So, you know, if Danielle Smith doesn't want to support it, that's perfectly fine in my opinion, but you do not and cannot act as an obstacle to it. And this Citizens Initiative Act was certainly an obstacle just to even to ask the question. So, you know, them having taken the steps, and you know, I had a conversation with Mickey Amory, you know, on Friday, and to his point is like, Nadine, this is coming back to my desk. You know, you're going to get the question. And so that, you know, I'm really happy to see, you know, a step in the right direction. And I just want to make sure that people understand that doesn't mean we get to just back off now. We have to keep marching forward.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Agreed.
Well, Bruce, you know, enjoy that nice, sunny, warm weather.
I'll do my best. It's a burden, but I'll see what I can do.
Awesome. All right, you guys, I'm going to let Bruce go. And for the rest of you, you're stuck with me for just a few more minutes. If you like this interview, please do like, share, subscribe to the channel to make sure that you don't miss any more content. And if you are up and able and willing to donate, obviously, you know, always appreciated. Thank you to those who have donated recently. All that goes right back into the editing and the content that you see here, and doing the research. So God bless you all. Again, hit that like, hit that share, notification bell, make sure that you don't miss any more opportunities. All right, God bless you all.